on Facebook, and I'm admitting everyone.
I see people I know. Hi, Sarah.
Katie, can you see people who are waiting in the waiting room?
I can, yeah.
And you can admit them?
I think so.
Okay, would you mind keeping an eye on that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. And I'm just making sure that Katie can let people in while I talk. So I think it's working. So
I just admitted someone, so I think we're good to go.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. So welcome again, everyone, to today's presentation. We're thrilled to have you join us for what is the second in a series of virtual events that we are hosting throughout this year, which is our 25th anniversary year. This is part of our celebrations. We're trying to reach out to our friends and partners and supporters with content, with information, with some fun events that we hope you'll keep attending. And our hope is really that through these events, you'll get to know more about us, the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission, and our work in supporting the preservation efforts of the state entity, the Texas Historical Commission, and we hope that you'll choose to support us in these efforts. I wanted to welcome any of our board members who might be on here, other than Michael, who's of course our presenter for the night. I know that a couple of our board members are joining us, so as I see them come on, I'll make sure to give a shout out to them. I did want to introduce our team. You all see Katie Kukerbaum here. She is the brains behind these events, and she's organizing all of them, which we're very appreciative of. Reina Andrade she's not on yet, but she's sort of the invisible force behind all of the work that we do, and she keeps us on the straight and narrow. And then Hope Baron, who is our social media intern. She is a recent addition to our team, and is the one who has been reaching out to you via Facebook at THC Friends, and on Instagram and Twitter at friends_THC. Please, if you are on social media, please do find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, like us, follow us. We really appreciate that. I also wanted to let you know that our next virtual event is scheduled for Saturday, April 24th at 2 p.m. We will be meeting virtually at Celia's Bake Oven at the Via de Austin exhibit at the San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site. And we will learn about the history of the town of San Felipe de Austin, and also about a special woman who lived and worked in that town during the Texas Revolution. And while we're at it, we will also participate in a food history discussion and demonstration. We're not quite sure of what recipe we will be demonstrating yet, but we will add that information to our website as soon as that's available. Registration for that is open at www.thcfriends.org. So please register for that event. It's going to be a fun event, Saturday afternoon. We promise you will enjoy it. And you get a behind the scenes look at a new up and coming exhibit, outdoor exhibit at this state historic site. So please join us then. I also wanted to welcome some of our THC colleagues who have joined us tonight. Thank you all for taking time to be with us this evening. A couple of housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. We do have a planned Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you will drop your name in the chat box, or your question, if you'd like us to ask that question, drop that in the chat box. We will shut down the screen share at the end of the presentation so we can all see each other, and you will have the ability to unmute yourself and ask the question of Michael yourself. So please feel free to do that. If you want to just put your questions in the chat box, just feel free to do that as well. We have about 25 people here right now, 24, 25 people. I'm sure people will keep joining as we go along. So please keep your microphones off, but your cameras on. We want to see your faces, and we want you to engage in the conversation once the presentation is over. It is now my privilege to introduce our speaker this evening. As you all may know, the Friends of the THC's motto is preserving the real places and real stories of Texas. So storytelling is a key part of the work that we do as the fundraising support partner to the commission, but storytelling is also key to the work of preservation itself. And our presenter tonight has combined his passion for athletics and his heritage in his storytelling and his books. Michael Hurd is a native Houstonian writer and historian who currently serves as the director of the Prairie View A&M University's Texas Institute for Preservation of History and Culture. This institute is currently digitally documenting 500 years of history in Texas. Michael is an Air Force and Vietnam veteran, and he is a recipient of the Air Force Commendation Medal. As a writer, Michael started his career at the Houston Post. He was a member of the 1982 founding staff of USA Today and has also written for the Austin American-Statesman and Yahoo Sports. Throughout his career, Michael covered a wide variety of sporting events, including 8 NBA finals, 2 Super Bowls, Major League Baseball, the National Hockey League, the 1984 Summer Olympics, and the NCAA. Michael has authored 3 books. His groundbreaking first book, Black College Football, from 1892 to 1992, is the only book that comprehensively documents the history of football programs at historically Black colleges. This book was a primary source in 1996 when the National Football Foundation began inducting Black college players to the College Football Hall of Fame. His most recent book, which is the one that he's going to be talking about today, Thursday Night Lights, the story of Black high school football in Texas, was named by the Texas Silver magazine as one of the 30 best Texas books for the 2010 to 2019 decade, and one of the 30 most essential books about Texas by the Houston Chronicle. Michael has also been featured in films, including the documentary Rights of Autumn, the story of college football, and First and Goal in the Bronx, a CBS sports documentary about the first Black college football game, Grambling versus Morgan State, played at the Yankee Stadium back in 1968. Michael was also a panelist in Washington, D.C. for the National Archives program, Breaking the Line, Black College Football and the Civil Rights Movement. Last but not the least, Michael currently serves as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission, and we are absolutely privileged to have him as part of our leadership. Thank you for that, Michael. Michael is also a Longhorn and a graduate in journalism from the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you again, Michael, for taking time this evening and being with us and sharing your stories. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Anjali. And thanks to you and Katie for asking me to speak. I think I've obviously done a lot of things. So basically, I think it just means that I'm old. So, but let's dive into it. You know, even though I know spring is upon us and the weather's changing beautifully and that sort of thing. I know being in Texas, it's never out of season to talk about football. So we're going to talk about a lot of football this evening. And I'm assuming most of you are football fans and will kind of get a lot of what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get on with it. We in business? Looking good? Okay, all right. So even as crazy as this state is about high school football, back in 2007, when I decided to write this book, to start researching and writing this book, I was really surprised, probably stunned, that nobody had ever done this particular book, talking about football at Black high schools. Though of course the reputation for high school football in Texas is pretty nationwide. People know about high school football in Texas, but not many people know about this story, about Thursday Night Lights and what went on those nights with the Black high schools. So the journalist in me was happy to be breaking some new ground, but in my heart, I was excited to research and write about people that I grew up with. Some of my friends, schoolmates, some were my teachers, and others I had only heard about, and others I had seen play on Wednesday and Thursday nights at Jefferson Stadium in Houston, which was a public school facility back in the day. And it was located right between the University of Houston campus and Jack Yates High School, which is on the other side, and so you have Jefferson Stadium right in the middle of those two schools. On that site now is TDECU Stadium, and it's the home to the University of Houston Cougars football program. Unfortunately, they tore down Jefferson to build this new stadium, but they left no acknowledgement about what had gone on there before. Jefferson Stadium was a huge venue in Houston for the Black community. And I think it's really sad that they just tore that stadium down and never bothered to acknowledge what had gone on there before and its importance to the Black community in Houston. So Thursday Night Lights is meant to both remember and introduce the Prairie View Interscholastic League, what it was, why and how it came to be, why and how it came to an end, but mostly I wanted to present some of the African-American men and boys who coached and played high school football in Texas during an era of well-defined racial divisiveness, and how they went about the business of building successful careers that should have earned them widespread acclaim and respect at that level, but it did not. I felt like I had been writing this book since adolescence, and I really had been in my mind. But the actual work was cathartic, it was fun, and at every turn it was emotional for me. There were so many memories of growing up on the fringes of the end of segregation and the beginning of integration, though every school I had attended was segregated. All Black students, faculty, administration, and of course, coaches and athletes. My first and only exposure to high school football came because I attended Ebony Worthing High School in Southeast Houston's Sunnyside neighborhood. And here we go. And these are some of the famous athletes who came out of Worthing. But to be honest, back then, I really had no idea what the Prairie View Interscholastic League was. In fact, I'd never heard of the Prairie View Interscholastic League. But it was the governing body for Black high school athletic, academic, and band competitions. And I only had a casual interest in what was going on with the white schools and what their teams were up to. And of course, those schools were governed by the University Interscholastic League, the UIL, and would become noted for their play under Friday Night Lights. But I lived the PVIL as a student at Worthing, cheering on the mighty Colts. Loyal and true to green and gold, we strive to be faithful to thee. I promise no more singing, but that's our school song. But the PVIL's reach extended well beyond football and other athletics and extracurricular activities. The PVIL was about community, it was about education, history, and heritage. And those are the central themes for Thursday Night Lights, which includes a pretty good dose of the evolution of Black history in Texas from 1920 to 1970. And as a PVIL product, I felt honored to document this incredible story of triumph during an era of legalized social divisiveness. The PVIL schools, at their peak, there were 500. though the great majority of those were not at the high school level, because they counted elementary schools, they counted junior and junior high schools. So that was the breadth of the PVIL's reach. So, but all in all, they were all ill-equipped with financial resources that were very lean. But what the league had, what the Black communities had back then, in abundance, was dedicated and caring people who accepted the task of preparing Black children for citizenship in a social environment that neither welcomed nor encouraged them. In talking with former PVIL players, I found out that I wasn't the only one who was puzzled by the term Friday Night Lights. One player that I talked to recalled playing at Jefferson, and he said to me, "You mean they use that stadium on Friday nights?" Another one was more blunt. He said, "Friday Night Lights? That's white folks." In talking with former PVIL players, those kinds of conversations kept coming up. But what the schools also had, despite their fiscal and social inequities, the spirits of the PVIL and its member schools were hardly dampened. The league created passionate school rivalries and had enthusiastic competitions that featured outstanding students who would become statesmen, such as Barbara Jordan, who was the PVIL debate champion as a senior at Wheatley High School in Houston. There were artists, musicians, entrepreneurs, and of course, professional athletes. In 1950, Heman Sweat from Jack Yates High School became the first Black student accepted to the University of Texas. And in 1991, Marcelite Harris from Cashmere Gardens in North Houston became the first Black female general in the Air Force and retired in 1997 as a major general and the highest ranking female officer in the Air Force. These are the kind of students that the PVIL schools were turning out. Athletically, the PVIL showcased some of the best prep football talent in the country in programs such as Abilene Woodson on the South Plains of West Texas, Blackshear High School in San Angelo, and along the petroleum-rich Gulf Coast, you had the Golden Triangle teams like Beaumont Hebert, Beaumont Charlton Pollard, Galveston Central, Port Arthur Lincoln. Back in Central Texas, you had Austin's L.C. Anderson, and then the Houston schools, Worthing, Yates, Washington, Wheatley. And in Dallas, you had Lincoln, Madison, and Washington, and I.M. Terrell in Fort Worth. East Texas was a veritable hotbed of talent in towns like Lufkin, Livingston, Texarkana, and Tyler. An example of some of the fun that I had in my research was being in Abilene on a cold and drizzly evening outside, but sitting inside the warmth of a small church dining hall and talking with some of the former Woodson players and enjoying the colorful stories and laughter flying left and right. For the most part, I turned on my recorder and just listened as the former teammates reminisced. But what really impressed me about this was the camaraderie. They still had that after all those years. They were not ex-teammates. They were still teammates and best friends. And the mood was as though they were still talking it up in the locker room after practice or before a game or after a game, or if they were hanging out around the corner at Larry's Burgers, which was a big hangout for them up there. The PVIL football honor roll reads like a who's who of national prep, college, and professional gridiron greats, from Dallas Lincoln's Charlie Choo Choo Brackens, who was the first Black quarterback drafted to the NFL in 1955 by the Green Bay Packers in the 16th round, to Eldridge Dickey, the Houston, Washington great, who was drafted ahead of Alabama's Kenny the Snake Stabler by the Oakland Raiders in 1968, becoming the first Black quarterback drafted in the NFL's first round. Dickey had a phenomenal career at Washington and Houston, and went on to Tennessee State to play for Big John Merritt. winning back-to-back Black College National Championships in 1965 and 66. And before then, Tennessee State was really downtrodden. They hadn't won a thing. So Dickey goes there, turns the program around, and John Merritt, the head coach, nicknamed him the Lord's Prayer, because he was the answer to the program's dreams, making them into a winner. There are more Pro Football Hall of Famers with Texas roots, last count was 28, than any other state. And 6 of those guys are products of the PVIL. Joe Green from Temple Dunbar. Kenny Houston played with the Oilers and the Redskins from Lufkin. Night Train Lane, Dick Night Train Lane played with the Detroit Lions, started at Austin Anderson. Charlie Taylor with the Washington Redskins from Grand Prairie Dalworth High School, and Gene Upshaw from Robstown. Emmett Thomas from Angleton Marshall, who was a quarterback at Angleton Marshall, but is in the Hall of Fame as a defensive back. But also consider that running back Ollie Matson, this is Ollie Matson, who is known as one of the greatest football players ever, college or pro. But he began his career in Houston at Jack Yates. But his family moved to San Francisco, and he became a big star at San Francisco University and became the first Black Texan, the first Black Texan to receive Heisman votes. He finished 9th in the voting in 1951. Also, Beaumont Hebert lineman Bubba Smith, the great Bubba Smith, who started Michigan State and became the #1 overall pick of the 1967 draft by the Baltimore Colts, was one of 5 players that year from PVIL schools who were taken that year as an NFL team's first choice. The others were Mel Farr, a running back from Hebert, and wide receiver Gene Washington from Baytown Carver. But also Gene Upshaw from Robstown also went first, and running back Willie Ellison from Lockhart Carver. Everywhere I went around the state, people knew about this game, the Yates-Wheatley Thanksgiving Day game. This was the event of the season for Black Houstonians, because early on, Booker T. Washington was the first Black high school in Houston. Then came Yates, and then a couple of years later came Wheatley. So you have descendants from all 3 of these schools. So in one household, you might have these factions rooting for either one of those teams. So on Thanksgiving Day, there would be parades in 3rd Ward for Yates, parades in 5th Ward for Wheatley, and it was just a festive day with a stadium that was filled to the brim, literally, as you can see in this photo, and you can barely see around the bottom there. Those are fans. That's not the team. Somewhere the team is in there, but there would be fans standing around the field. That's how popular that game was, and how big a deal was it to be there. And that was really the place to be on Thanksgiving Day for about 20 years or so. Started in the late 40s. This was one of my favorite teams in the PVIL, coached by Charles Brown on the far right there. He's the coach, nice hat. Coach Brown had a great run at Conroe Washington High School, which was at the 2A level. They had 2 undefeated state championship teams. Both teams were 13-0. So for 1960 and 1965, both of those teams were combined 26-0. But the Bulldogs played for the state championship five out of the other 6, 5 out of those other 6 seasons, from 1960 to 1965. I came across this quote. I'll give you a chance to read it, but I just thought this was astounding that somebody of Earl Campbell's stature didn't think he was even the best football player in his own household. You know, his brothers Willie and Herbert played at Emmett Scott, which was the PVIL school in Tyler, and they were both really good linemen. But neither one of those guys really got an opportunity in terms of playing college football or getting any kind of exposure that like Earl did. This is the earliest program that I could find for a Black high school program. This is Dallas Colored School. This is their 1909 team. Dallas Colored School would become, a few years later, it would become Booker T. Washington. And there were so few teams back then for Black high schools to compete against that they had to compete against some of the Black college teams, you know. So for instance, Dallas Colored School one year had to play Wiley College, which is in Marshall, Texas. And that's a nice 150-mile drive one way. But those were the only options that they had for opponents back then. Of course, they were the only Black school in Dallas. That was before Lincoln and Washington. So that's what they had to do back then. In 1910, the Debating League of Texas High Schools was organized at the University of Texas, as was the Interscholastic Athletic Association. The purpose of both of those organizations was to oversee their respective competitions, debate, and athletics for high school teams throughout the state. Academic and music events would be added later, but the two groups would merge in 1913 to form the UIL. That same year, the UIL amended its bylaws to include a stipulation defining its membership, noting that its membership was open only to, quote, any public white school, end quote. Now, this is less than a half century after emancipation, so Black schools statewide are still relatively in their infancies and struggling just to exist in an atmosphere that vehemently railed against the education of Negroes back then. The opinion of one Waco newspaper editor in 1869 decried educating Negroes because, quote, "We do not approve their sending their children to school for a mere highfalutin idea of making them smart and like white folks," end quote. So, tasked with providing organized extracurricular activities for Black high school students, the Black academicians who first met to form the Texas Interscholastic League of Colored Schools in 1920 were nothing less than excited about the prospect of shaping the athletic and academic destinies of generations of Black kids. At a November 1920 meeting in Houston, men from the Colored Teachers State Association of Texas sought to provide leadership for Black high school student competitions in the same manner as the UIL was doing for white students. The Prairie View principal then, J.G. Osborne, would serve as the chief officer of the TILCS with the title of executive secretary. The TILCS schools came to be through the struggles to educate African Americans after emancipation, and most of the efforts originated at the all-Black college on the site of a former plantation in the community of Prairie View. However, the league didn't have a real structure until the 1940 season. To that point, anybody that had a good season and maybe closed its schedule with a win over its biggest rival could proclaim itself as a PVIL state champion. So if you were in Lubbock and you won all your games and maybe you beat Amarillo in the big game, you could claim you were the state champion. If you were in Houston at Yates and you beat Wheatley and you had a good season, well, you could claim you're the state champion. So you could go back and forth like that. But in 1939, Jack Yates coach Pat Patterson suggested to his principal, William Holland, that a statewide district setup be broken into 4 regions and a playoff structure set to decide a state champion. And this was the first district alignment for the PVIL in the 4 areas. And as a result of that, at the end of the 1940 season, the PVIL had its first legit state champion. And that was Coach Marion Bates' team from Fort Worth Terrell, who beat Austin Anderson 26-0, claiming the first PVIL championship. And this is the cover of their championship banquet program. So the league finally had formal structure, but still lacked widespread recognition. But meanwhile, at the UIL schools, football was already well into becoming more popular and more important than breathing itself, with myths and legends being born and touchdown scoring heroes being deified statewide on Friday nights. There was no shortage of related newspaper and magazine articles, books, and movies about high school football in Texas, as fans of the UIL schools and a fawning mainstream media delighted in telling the stories of slinging Sammy Baugh, Doak Walker, Bobby Lane, Super Bill Bradley, Kenny Hall, the Sugarland Express, and other guys. And the programs that produced players like them in Odessa, Brownwood, and Dangerfield, and in Cleburne. And it didn't hurt that most of those guys could stay in state and demonstrate their blue chip brilliance at the major college level in the Southwest Conference back then, an alliance of 7 schools and their northeast border neighbor, the University of Arkansas. That league existed for 82 years, beginning in 1914. So you have white kids who were Friday night lights heroes, easily staying in state and making these seamless transitions to Saturday afternoon college performances that also brought acclaim to their high school teams and their coaches. The Black media was the main source of PVIL coverage. The weekly Black newspapers like the Houston Informer with Lloyd Wells' Dateline Sports column, which I used to read religiously every week, Bud Johnson in the Houston Forward Times, the San Antonio Register, the Dallas Examiner, and other Black media outlets were dedicated to trumpeting Black schools through their audience, though their audience were limited in reach compared to state and national wire services and the large dailies such as the Houston Post and the Dallas Morning News, whose coverage of PVIL games was limited to a few paragraphs, if that, from special correspondence. But I remember every Thursday when I was in school, I would run to the neighborhood grocery store to pick up a copy of the Forward Times or the Houston Informer, because they were writing about us in a positive way. They were writing about people that I knew. They were writing about my friends and my classmates, my teachers, family members, my churches. These were the papers that were so influential and important in the Black community. They covered the PVIL games. So, but while the PVIL was relegated to languishing in the shadow of the UIL, which went about building its brand of Friday Night Lights and that image of high school football, but which it would proclaim itself as Texas as the prep football capital of the nation. However, the PVIL could also stake a legitimate claim to its own prowess with programs that featured speed, athleticism, and a taste of showmanship, all to the knowledge of hardly anyone, except Black colleges. Segregation meant success for Black college programs in athletics and academia, given that they automatically got the best and the brightest athletes and students from Black communities and built golden recruiting pipelines connected to Black high schools and their blue chip talent. In Texas, that meant schools like Prairie View, Wiley, Texas Southern, and Texas College, who are all members of the Southwestern Athletic Conference, the mighty SWAC. All of those schools won Black college national championships at one time or another. Prairie View won 5 before integration. And that's all because of this homegrown PVIL talent. They didn't go out of state to recruit. They couldn't afford to in the first place. They had all of this homegrown talent, and there was so much of it spread around the state that each one of those schools could capitalize on that and win national championships. Those schools existed in a recruiting paradise where access to quick, speedy running backs, strong arm quarterbacks, and true-handed receivers, bone-jarring tacklers often came through casual conversations or advice from relatives, or teachers, all eager to sway a good player towards their alma mater. Black colleges thrived on that system during segregation. Their no-budget budgets didn't allow for extensive recruiting trips, but the coaches could be just as effective bringing in talent just for the cost of lobbying a long-distance phone call. And that's how Billy Nix was so successful at Prairie View with that homegrown talent, PVIL talent. Nix's influence around the state was to Black high schools as Darrell Royals was to white high schools, and the Prairie View Panthers were the Black community's Texas Longhorns. But here's what Nix did. Back then, there was no NFL dream for Black players because from the early 30s to the mid 1940s, There were no black players in the NFL. The NFL, after Fritz Pollard in the early 30s, just didn't have black players. They didn't want anything to do with that. So they finally pick up again in the mid 40s. But in the interim, what black college players did was a wonderful thing. They got their degrees. The majority of those guys got their degrees. They went back to their hometowns to teach and coach. And Nix was at the forefront of that. He had so many good players. He got a lot of those guys coaching jobs. They would go back to their schools, coach, and they would all send their best players to Nix. Nix, all he had to do was pick up a phone and say, you got a really good player there. I want him here. End of story. That was his recruiting pitch. But the options for the PVIL players outside of the South were much greater. There was a stream of PVIL talent that left the state to play college football, and that would pick up in the 60s with Mel Farr from Beaumont going to UCLA, where he was a consensus All-American running back, and future Hall of Fame wide receiver Charlie Taylor at Dalworth went to Arizona State in the 60s, where he was an exceptionally good player there. So while there might not have been an overt acknowledgement around Texas about this kind of talent, the coaches outside of Texas and the recruiters from the Big Ten, the Big Eight, the Pacific Eight were well acquainted with these guys, these players, and were open to recruiting what PVIL programs had to offer. And what you see here, Coach Doherty would come down to the Beaumont area and do coaching clinics for the black coaches, because of course coaching clinics were segregated then too. But it was also a recruiting trip, and this is how he got a lot of his players. And you see included here, number 95 in the back is Bubba Smith, and number 84 up front was Gene Washington. And they played on some great Michigan State teams that won national championship. But if you were looking for a football player during the off season, you only had to attend a PVIL track meet, because a lot of the football players also ran track because they were really fast. So, but you had players like Cliff Branch, who was my classmate and a good friend at Worthing. In his senior year, Cliff ran an unprecedented 9.3 clocking in the 100-yard dash in the 4A event at the PVIL state meet. He was the first schoolboy to run that kind of time. That record lasted as long as it took them to set up for the next meet, when a kid from Wichita Falls, Washington, named Reggie Robinson bested Cliff Branch's time with a blistering, and you track people will appreciate that. He ran a 9.1 clocking, and that is really running fast. So even though Cliff would find his calling on the football field and earn 3 Super Bowl rings as an all-pro wide receiver with the Raiders, after a collegiate stop at the University of Colorado. But I talked with him for my book, and this is what he told me. He said, we didn't recognize that we had a special league, but we did. We had a league of our own on Wednesday and Thursday nights at Jefferson Stadium. We didn't feel slighted because the competition was so strong. Yates, Wheatley, Kashmir, the Beaumont schools. It was special football. And a lot of the athletes that came out of the PVIL went on to great careers in colleges and Pro Bowl type careers in the pros. There were a lot of great athletes that came out of this league, quote. So while it was not unusual for some of the woefully underfunded black schools to outfit their teams with hand-me-down equipment, including jockstraps, mind you, from white schools, the quality of play at black schools proved to be anything but second rate. For 50 years, the PVIL produced a wealth of outstanding players and coaches that few in the Lone Star State outside of black communities cared to acknowledge, though most areas had dual educational facilities, one for whites, one for blacks, with dual athletic programs that ignored each other. Bubba Smith talked about that era, and he said, there was the black side of town and the white side, and you just dealt with what was laid out there for you. You didn't have time to think, why can't I do that? Why is it like that? Sometimes I think a large part of my life was lost by that. but you could always show what you had on the football field. And in the PVIL, you're talking about people who could righteously play the game. None of the teams were diluted back then. Everyone on the field could play. If you blinked, they were gone. It was more physical and tougher. And it always meant something if you could outrun somebody, because everybody could run. But with integration encroaching and the PVIL peaking in 1967, the league would run out of time and the UIL would receive a sudden infusion of what the great Florida A&M coach Jay Gaither would describe his ideal players: mobile, agile, and hostile. Blue chip Black players who would legitimize the UIL's claim to having the best high school football talent in the land. The PVIL merged, though I won't go too far off into this, but trust me, it was not a merger. Black schools were closed, and they bused Black kids to white schools. There was no busing in the reverse. And they closed a ton of those Black schools immediately. So it was not a merger. And the UIL didn't even acknowledge the PVIL's existence in terms of their records until 1995 or 1996. But the 1967 season was the first year Black and white schools competed against each other, and Black players were integrated into formerly all-white programs. Now you see grandsons descended from the PVIL athletes who are being celebrated for their play at UIL schools. But on the other hand, their grandfathers who played in the PVIL are still unrecognized. Excuse me. Integration ended the PVIL. Yet when they closed shop in 1970, the PVIL could look back on a wealth of success stories and a football legacy that remains one of the most important and unheralded in the evolution of the Black community in Texas. And in closing, I have to say that there were so many men with who I was unable to connect, but the accounts of the men included in the book give a good overview and insight to the PVIL experience. It was the few speaking for the many. In group meetings where former teammates and coaches gathered to tell me their stories, and through one-on-one telephone interviews, I was constantly impressed with their spirits, not just the team camaraderie, but a solid sense of family that has remained intact through several passing decades. It's those kinds of stories, those kinds of voices that I wanted to give a forum. I had attended several Hall of Fame and Hall of Honor banquets for PVIL coaches through the PVIL Coaches Association, the group that diligently works to maintain and promote the league's history and honor the men and women who excelled as athletes and coaches at the all-Black high schools. Those banquets are like sitting down at a family dinner because of the history of athletic and academic relationships for the folks in attendance who have histories from that era. The same schools, the same towns, competitions. And it doesn't matter that no one outside of those large hotel ballrooms where the banquets are held knows about the luminaries being lauded inside. It was humbling to see in one place so many men I'd heard about and admired, former teammates reuniting, former foes embracing, laughing and reminiscing. Hey man, yeah, of course I remember you. I remember that game, and I remember that play. You know, for a couple of minutes, each one gets to stand before their peers, their families and friends, accept the plaque, noting their induction to the PVILCA Hall of Fame and Hall of Honor, and express a gratitude to a higher power, to their family, and to the PVILCA for understanding, for someone finally saying, quote, "We know what you went through, how you excelled, and how you," how you've earned this moment. For most of them, it is the first time they have been publicly acknowledged to this extent. And their heartfelt and at times tearful words of thanks are incredibly moving, because everyone also knows the social struggles they survived in a system that denied and denigrated yet clearly did not douse their spirits. I was told by one former player who bought the book and showed it to his grandson. He flipped through the pages. He found his name. He turned, wow. He turned to his grandson and he said, "Look, I'm in this book." Those are the guys for who I wrote Thursday Night Lights. Thank you.
Silence on that for a couple of moments. Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for that incredible presentation. This is my second time hearing you speak about this, and it still moves. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'd love for all of you to turn on your cameras and just chat with Michael. Please throw out your questions in the chat box or raise your hand. I'll call on you, and you're welcome to just, jump in and ask your question or share some thoughts, whatever is your fancy. We have some comments in the chat box, Michael, from several people.
Okay.
Mike Workman. Mike, would you share what this video is all about? The one that you've, this is the video for this presentation, the Facebook Live link.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Sometimes it's nice for people to know that they can go back, because I came in a little bit late and I'll pick up. Well, I have a quick question I can ask, even though I came in late.
Sure.
I was a classmate at North Texas with Mean Joe Green back in the 1968-69 season.
Okay.
And I think he's kind of a crossover figure, because in high school he played one system, but in college he went to a school where Abner Haynes had broken the barrier for him long before he got there.
Mhm.
Can you talk about Joe Green as an example of someone who bridged both worlds?
Well, Mike, there were a lot of those guys like that.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, it's kind of a, they talked about, and they still say this about a lot of Black coaches, that they had so much talent they didn't have to coach. They didn't know how to coach and that sort of thing. Just throw the ball out there and let them play. But I guarantee you, those guys, when they did get to the college level, they were prepared. They were ready to go. Guys like Mean Joe and Abner Haynes and so forth, and all the guys that I talk with, who were back in the PVIL back in those days, and then you get to what you talk about bridging the gap in the late 60s when they started integration, and you had that group of kids who maybe had started out at a Black school, but then went to previously formerly a white school for maybe a couple of years, and that was a big culture shock on both sides, But the sad thing about that bridging the gap era is that so many Black teachers and coaches lost their jobs, and they were incredible coaches who might have won state championships, district championships, or whatever. But when integration came, they were asked to move to the new school, the other school, and they were anything but coaches there. They just carried clipboards. They were more there to be conduits to help their kids, Black kids, and their new white coaches learn to get along together. So that was not an uncommon occurrence.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed it, Mr. Hurd. If I can go next, I
Yeah.
have your book.
Woo-hoo!
My brother graduated from Hebert High School, born my Texas class of 60.
Yes.
I'm 20 years younger than him. He's deceased now, but I wrote in the chat that they, Texas Southern in Houston recruited and gave 7 of they won state, by the way, Dallas Lincoln. I wasn't born. He never talked about it. I didn't even know he played on Thursday nights. I was born in 1962, 20 years after. He was already in college, but they recruited 7 young men off of that state team and took them into Texas Southern, and they were all roommates. I guess they were all in one dormitory room with Warren Wells' brother.
Warren Wells.
Yeah, Herman Compton. And
Yeah.
I grew up hearing about it. And I actually went to Hebert before it was changed to Westview, and they merged with Forest Park. But I didn't get to see, saw the Friday night lights, but you would have never known, because they talked about it. They played the state game in a little high school stadium, which we would use now as a junior varsity stadium here in Beaumont.
Exactly. And those were, you mentioned Warren Wells, and I'll just say to you guys who don't know of Warren Wells, who Kenny Houston called Dr. Doom, was one of the greatest
Raiders
wide receivers in the history of pro football.
Yes.
But yeah, Beaumont was a hotbed for, and I think they call Beaumont the pro football capital of the world.
Yeah, I knew Warren very well.
But Warren is also an example of the type of talent that the PVIL schools produced that went on to play at historically Black colleges. Thank you for the question.
To hear you talk tonight. I'm so grateful. I really appreciate it. I ran home from work to hurry up and tune in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
CLB, I know you have your hand raised. Did you have a question or a comment that you'd like to share? And please share your name too. That would be
Hi, Mr. Hurd. My name is Corey Bean. I'm a United States history professor with a focus on sports. I teach at South Plains College and Texas Tech.
Okay.
My question is, can you talk about the funding for all these programs? Did they have sponsorships of local businesses, or where did the money come from?
Well, as I mentioned, they didn't get a lot of money, from, I guess, traditional sources, school district and that sort of thing. All those schools were always very underfunded. So what you had, they really were a community effort. There were a lot of, we might laugh and joke about kids doing bake sales and all that sort of thing nowadays, but that was a lot of what they did. They got money, just fundraising in the community, and one of the things that I mentioned in the book, in Conroe, Washington, if you drove by Coach Brown's house, Mrs. Brown would be out back hanging uniforms out to dry because on the clothesline, because she was their basically their manager. They couldn't afford that sort of thing, and talking about getting all the hand-me-downs, but no, the funding that they got, was just it was a community effort throughout, and that was an era where the Black communities were so structured, so tight, and everybody literally did know just about everybody, and so, between the churches and other community groups, passing the hat, that's how they got a lot of the funding that they needed. But everything else was basically hand-me-down, from uniforms to books to laboratory equipment and whatever. I had one coach, Dan Haskins at Texarkana Dunbar, who, when they integrated, he goes to the white school and he's meeting the coaches there, and he says, "You don't need to tell me your names. I know all of you. I have your books. I have your names in all of my textbooks, so I know all, because you would sign for your textbooks." But yeah, that was the big funding effort there.
Well, I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Sarah Jenkins, you had your hand up.
I do. Hi, Michael. So you're talking about the Black media and the white media.
Mm-hmm.
So when you had somebody like Bubba Smith, and he goes to Michigan, and then he's the #1 NFL draft pick. How did the white media handle that? At
the high school level?
No, once he
once he gets to Michigan State and he's huge, he's in every paper and sports magazine in the country. That whole they had that chant at Michigan State, "Kill Bubba, kill."
Yeah.
He's a defensive lineman. So once he gets to Michigan State, media is not a problem. He's on national TV. Now different story playing in growing up and playing high school football in Texas. And I talk about this in the book, Gene Washington, who played at a Baytown, in Baytown, and he talks about how he couldn't wait to get out of Texas because the newspaper coverage was so slim. They weren't talking about those guys in the morning news and the Chronicle and all of the big newspapers. But you would have to go to the black media. Like I said, I read those, the Informer and the Forward Times like crazy. And a lot of my research came while finding black newspapers online, now on newspapers.com and that sort of thing, because those are the papers that cover those teams. University of North Texas has the Portal of Texas History, and they have a lot of those papers as well. And that's why, and that's how I find a lot of those sources. They just didn't cover those guys back then. They just didn't. Other than the playoffs, back in the day, they called it the agate page.
Right.
The scoreboard page, they would just list the scores, Worthing, Gates, whatever, that sort of thing. But that was really the extent of it. For playoffs, they would go the extra mile and add maybe 5 or 6 paragraphs. But generally, they didn't really cover it on a day-to-day basis, like now where you've got, TV cameras at practices and that sort of thing, and feature stories. I didn't find one feature story. I didn't, I'm sorry, I picked it back. I found one feature story, talking about who this person was, this coach was, and what their methods and what they did. The coverage was not to that extent for those guys at all.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Jerry Etkin, you're welcome to jump in and ask a question, or if you prefer, I can ask it for you. You put it in the chat box. If you'd like to just jump in, please feel free. Well, I'll go ahead and ask the question. Jerry asks, is there any Hall of Fame building or sports museum to bring all of these wonderful stories to the public to see? Would Prairie View A&M sponsor such an institution?
We're trying. I'll put it like that. There have been talks about a museum on campus, and the PVIL would certainly be a big part of that. To answer your question directly, no, there's nothing like that now. The PVIL itself is looking for a home, and we're hoping that Prairie View would end up being the home for all of their memorabilia and that sort of thing, of which a lot of that stuff really didn't survive when integration came in and they tore down a lot of the black schools. They also destroyed a lot of the memorabilia. But no, there's no formal place right now for just, it's in Robert Brown's attic for the most part. Mr. Brown is the chairman for the PVIL Coaches Association, and they put on the banquet, and they have all of that memorabilia, and they're looking for a home, and we're hoping at some point that home will be at Prairie View.
Michael Nance has a comment in the chat box, and he was sharing this with you, Michael, and with Sarah McCleskey, who is the Texas Historical Commission's Historical Markers Program coordinator.
Mm-hmm.
He says that the Harris County Historical Commission is submitting a state historical marker app for the Turkey Day game. And Mike Nance is helping his friend Deborah Sloan with it, and THC is going to receive that application soon. So there'll be a marker in the works for the Turkey Day game. I
am so thrilled to hear that. That is very deserving. And I know Deborah, and I'm going to talk with her. I wasn't aware of this, but thank you for letting me know about that. And I will talk with her, because that is so deserving. I mean, that game was the largest high school event in the country, for well over 10 years, and it just kind of fell apart, with integration, and they don't play that anymore. So I'm glad to hear that.
That picture that you shared was just incredible.
Yeah, it really was the event of the season for Black Houstonians.
Yes. Thank you for talking with us today. It was a great talk, and that picture was fantastic. It was just amazing.
Thank
I
you.
work with preservations across the state, and a lot of groups are associated with the high schools, alumni associations. And obviously that's not your direct audience, but it certainly is an interested audience. And I guess I wondered how you'd been able, or if you'd been able to connect with those groups who, they're the same people who are saying, I know this guy. Oh, this is my brother, this is my cousin, this is my best friend, who would just love this book. And I guess I wondered if you were able to connect with any of those alumni associations.
Yeah, I have. And those are, no offense here, those are my favorite events. Because those people, it's about them. And they totally dig this book. And so I've been able to connect with a lot of them. I know in Livingston and in Abilene and in some other places. Yeah, I definitely was able to connect with a lot of those groups, and I've had the opportunities. They've invited me to speak, and like I said, I just really enjoyed it because again, and this book is about them. It's about their era, and they've really been nice about having me to come out and speak, and of course buying the book and talking about it.
Yeah. We have someone on the phone, 936-215-4364. Please jump in and ask a question. You've had your hand up for a while. I apologize for not calling on you sooner. But please jump in if you'd like to ask your question.
Oh, thank you. I just had to keep on hitting my *9. Yes. Thanks, Michael. I heard about your book a few years ago when I was at the Livingston Library, and one of the girls, Sabrina, she said, "Oh, Joyce, you'll be interested in this book." And Marion Johnson, you talk about him. He was my next door neighbor for years. And I hope he's on the line because I sent him the link to let him know that you were going to be talking tonight. And I just wanted to share that back in those days, our homemaking department cooked for these football players because we couldn't go. They couldn't go to the restaurant.
Exactly.
Yes, we would spend all day cooking. And you know what? We loved our teams. And thank you, Michael, for writing this book. And we need to really get it out there, get your book out there so people can know more about it. And thank you for calling on me.
Thank you for that story. That is, I talked about Coach Brown's wife doing the laundry, but yes, a lot of the home economic departments were springing into action when visiting teams would come in, and they would get a pregame meal through the home team's home economics department. So that was another way that, because they couldn't, traveling on buses, they couldn't stop anywhere. Nobody's going to serve, they weren't going to serve a busload of Black football players or Black people in general. So they point A to point B back to point A, and that was it.
Natera Austin has a question. Natera, if you'd like to jump in and ask a question, or I'm happy to ask it for you. It's in the chat box. Feel free to jump in if you're still with us here. Well, I'll go ahead and ask. And this question is similar to one that was asked a little while ago. We have made some progress at bridging the gap, yet we still see a difference in media coverage, for example, of HBCU teams versus white institutions. Would like to hear your thoughts on how we ensure AA athletes' stories and accomplishments are not overlooked today.
Well, that's a very good question, and it's something that I've been dealing with. I started writing sports in 1979 at the Houston Post, and one of my first beats was Texas Southern and the SWAC, and I'm pretty sure I was the first Black full-time sports writer at the Post and the Austin American Statesman. If somebody out there knows that, can call me on it, but I'm pretty sure that I was. And the big problem was, and one of the things that, I don't know, I won't say it bugged me, but all right, you go out and cover the black school. And that was a big deal because nobody didn't really cover those guys on a regular basis, if at all. And so a lot of times they were just thrilled to death to see me come out there and to write about it. But for that question, I mean, you're correct, because there still is this lack of coverage, for Black colleges, and it's ongoing, and I don't know how to turn it around. You're starting to see more Black college football games on ESPN, and of course now with Deion Sanders at Jackson State, all of their games have been on ESPN so far. So that's one thing, and I'm really appreciating that. And slowly but surely, you're starting to see reporters out at the Black colleges, more often, if not on a regular basis, at least more often than back in the day when I was doing that. But there's still a long way to go. People are still not. They don't know about a lot of the players and coaches at these schools, and they certainly don't know the history of those schools. So there's still so far to go. We're starting to see more with more Black sports writers. That helps because they know what they know what those schools are about, and they want to write those stories. They want to tell those stories. So slowly but surely, it's getting along, but it's pretty much at a snail's pace. I don't know how you speed it up. I just don't know what that answer is.
We have a few comments in here. Our colleague Rebecca Nebraska from TextDot says she's been working with Austin ISD and the alumni of the old L.C. Anderson High School to have a marker at their school stadium, likely the only remaining Black high school football stadium in Texas. There were only a handful built in the first place. Mm-hmm. And she says they're just waiting for the marker text to come from teams. So I'm assuming that that's already been submitted and it's being reviewed.
Yeah.
And they're also trying to get it listed in the National Register of Historic Places. So that's wonderful.
That's awesome, Rebecca. And thank you so much. Rebecca's really been doing some great work in regard to telling the story of Austin Anderson. I really appreciate your work, Rebecca. But yeah, I don't know. Excuse me, she makes a great point, because most of the Black schools didn't have their own stadium. I grew up in Texarkana. I was born and grew up in Texarkana in my early years. And Texarkana Dunbar did have its own stadium. And the elementary school was right behind the stadium. And I remember my classmates and I used to run over there at halftime, just ripping and running up and down the field, pretending to be Dunbar players. So that was just a lot of fun. But no, most of those schools didn't have a stadium at all. We call them stadiums, but they were, of course, just wooden bleachers, but they were nice places.
Stephanie Cade also shares that her mother spoke of cooking for the players to take food with them, and this was a booster club, and taking up donations for them to go and play out of town. So this also goes to Ms. Bean's question about funding. This is how.
Yeah, and you mentioned my other book, Black College Football, 1892-1992. In a way, I felt like I just wrote the same book twice, because the experience for Black college programs and the PVIL programs was almost exactly the same in terms of media coverage or lack thereof, and the travel and accommodations and that sort of thing. It's pretty much, it's pretty much the same thing. And like I said, that's the connection between the Black high schools and the Black colleges. I mean, it really is like a family thing. They're joined at the hip, but the very similar stories throughout.
I wanted to pop in here and say hello to Michael. This is Lisa Stafford.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi. So I wanted to just mention that I'm, like I said, Michael's colleague. I work at the John B. Coleman Library, and our library and our archives and special collections area, we have the eligibility records and all of the founding documents for the PVIL since it began on, with our campus, and all the competitions were held on the campus. So all of the early directors and, like I said, all of the eligibility records for the all the schools that were in the 554 counties of the state. So for research purposes, that's where you will go to find that information. All of the pertinent, memorabilia that Michael spoke of, that is what we're seeking to have those two.
Oh, excuse me. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, Lisa is with the Prairie View, the Prairie View Special Collections Library, and they have a lot of documentation for the PVIL, and were very helpful in my research. I got a lot of good stuff from them.
Mary Ann also asks, what is the state of high school football at Black high schools in Houston now, at Yates and Wheatley specifically?
You were breaking up on me. I think you said, what's the
state of high school football at Black high schools in Houston now?
Well, I went to my 50th class reunion a couple of years ago, and it was Worthing and Yates, and I was stunned. I counted, there were maybe 30 players on both teams on their sidelines. Of course, back in the day, there were maybe 50 or 60, whatever. Or there were a lot more than 25 or 30 players. And they all looked so small, for one, and maybe that's because I'm older or whatever. But it's not like it was, and it's never going to be like that again. I'll just put it like that. There are some decent teams left, but really there are only 8 Black high school, formerly PVIL schools, still open. 5 schools in Houston, Worthing, Yates, Wheatley, Kashmere, Washington, I think, and 3 schools in the Metroplex, Dallas. I forget the schools in Dallas, but so maybe 8 schools left. So very much on the decline. The talent is certainly not what it was back then. Like Bubba Smith was saying, everybody could play, everybody could run, and it's not that anymore. So you're not getting these tons of blue chip talent coming out of the Black high schools anymore. So it's very different now.
Well, thank you. I think that's the end of all the questions and comments. Somebody asked if a recording will be available, and yes, we will send a link out with the recording. Thank you, Michael, again for taking all this time and making yourself available for this presentation, sharing your stories with us. And thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we hope that you will join us for our next event, again, April 24th. We will be at the San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site. We'll be doing some baking in the bake oven, and we'll be learning about the history of Celia Allen, who was a freed woman who lived in the town of San Felipe de Austin, owned the bake oven, and raised her family. And she stayed there through the Texas Revolution, did not leave when Santa Anna's armies came through, and died there and is buried there. So we look forward to sharing that story with you, and having a conversation about some food from that time. In the meantime, thank you again. We appreciate your time this evening. Have a wonderful rest of the evening and a great weekend. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you again for having me, Anjali, and thank you all for attending, and I really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Amy.